students from different backgrounds require additional support, additional interventions. And we've looked as well at the ways in which we can integrate. So we can integrate research, we can address well-being, address inequalities within guidance systems. And in Canada, we've seen the development of a new career education framework, and we're going to be talking about that now. So I'm going to invite Tricia to see if she can share her slides. Fantastic. We see them very nicely. And oh,
there we go. Can we?
Here we go. So Tricia, do you want to say a word of introduction to yourself, for people who don't know you?
Sure thing. So as Anthony said, my name is Tricia Berry, and I'm a learning specialist with the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development in New Brunswick, Canada. And I'm so pleased to be joining the OECD and Anthony in this final session today. It has been amazing. The sessions that I've been to, it definitely is affirming, and I think that the wonderful work that folks are doing is going to be part of this conversation today. I wasn't able to attend all of the sessions, as many of them happened in the middle of the night, but I look forward to going back and watching some of those recordings.
Excellent. So I would say to people, Tricia and I are going to talk for maybe between about 30, 35 minutes or so. And what we'd ask you is that if you have comments or questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And you see the icon there at the bottom middle of your screen. So just click on chat and you can follow the conversation. It's great as ever if people don't mind taking a moment to say where they're from in the chat. That's always really good, to see. And we're going to do this in two parts. And Tricia is going to start. So Tricia, over to you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start actually with a video. This is a video that we produced here in New Brunswick to outline our career education strategy, which we call Career Connected Learning K-12. And I think it will be nice to start here so that we all have this context as we engage in our conversation today about the development of a career education framework and the work that that took. So I'll play the video and then we'll discuss further.
We've always known that the world was going to change dramatically for young people. We've got an aging population in New Brunswick. It's a reality. We have 60,000 jobs to fill in the next 5 years. Employers are feeling like there's a skills gap, that the credentials are not actually matching up with the skills that they need from their employees. Employers need their future workforce to be adaptable. They need them to be able to pivot and change and learn on the job and be willing and able to use those career development skills to continuously evolve because the world of work is constantly changing. Well, I think part of the problem is that young people are really struggling to have a plan and to find their purpose and to make choices. And that causes a lot of uncertainty. And we see young people struggling with mental health, and we see anxiety and worry and concern. So it seems that young people feel that they need to leave New Brunswick because they don't think there's any opportunities.
Is there a solution?
Yes, there is. It's Career Connected Learning K-12. Career Connected Learning is about intentionally incorporating career education best practices into all grades and all subjects. And it's using the best practices that we have identified after doing extensive research around the globe on what best prepares young people for the future. So it's about educators having the opportunity to make instructional choices and incorporate best practices into their curriculum and into what they're teaching. It's not an add-on, but really intended to bolster young people's opportunities and their ability to develop the skills, knowledge, and attitudes they need in order to transition throughout school and beyond. We've developed a series of online modules that are meant to help educators deliver career education regardless of grade or subject. So they're very practical, and they give an abundance of ideas and strategies and resources for intentionally incorporating those best practices into your classroom. At the root and the heart of all good educators, they really care about young people's success now and in the future, and want them to be productive and healthy and hopeful citizens. Now is the time for us to really look at how can we do better. What are we going to do moving forward in helping to prepare young people? And we have to think differently. We need to be innovative. We can't do career education the way we always have. It's K to 12. It's everyone's responsibility to help young people prepare for the future. Regardless of grade or subject, everyone is a career influencer, and in turn needs to intentionally incorporate these best practices into their classrooms, into their work. Not an add-on, but just instructional choice and a way of helping young people to be prepared for the future.
So thank you for watching that, and hopefully that really gives you that overview of the type of work we're doing in career-connected learning. So our strategy really focuses on the systemic advancement of the design and delivery of career education. More specifically, we're working to continue to ensure effective transitioning for all, including learners with diverse needs. And I think that really speaks to some of the sessions that we were just in the breakout rooms. We determined that we really needed to develop a career education framework to further leverage career-connected learning best practices. Those practices you heard in the video, like experiential learning, labor market information learning, social, emotional, global competency learning, and financial wellness. And as you can see on the screen, there are many initiatives that are happening in New Brunswick that have informed that strategy, but also have really necessitated the development of a career education framework. So these initiatives that you see and the associated research have contributed to our career education framework. So just to speak to them a bit, the 10-year education plan states that to be successful in both the present and the future, learners require the global competencies necessary to be open and engaged citizens. So we recognize that a career education framework would offer more guidance and support as we continue to work towards making career education and career-connected learning equitable in its delivery and access. And speaking to that, our policy 322 is our policy on inclusive education in New Brunswick. And it is important, as we have considered the need for each learner in New Brunswick to have access to career education and the associated financial, societal, and educational benefits. The portrait of a learner is what guides the decisions and actions of everyone involved in the education of New Brunswick youth by providing a context for the opportunities that learners need to determine their own pathways and to contribute to society. Our career education framework is able to capture those opportunities. Further, the framework works to support the development of global competencies and brings students towards that portrait of a learner at graduation. But most importantly, preparing our learners with the skills, sets of knowledges, and attitudes of a well-rounded person. As New Brunswick moves towards new high school graduation requirements that reflect the changing needs of our learners and society, the framework is going to help support the continuum of learning that will prepare learners to make more choices and earlier along through their high school pathway towards their post-secondary lives. Lastly, New Brunswick's Future Wabanaki, Avenir MB, and Future MB, along with Policy 307 on experiential learning, can work with the career education framework as it provides a roadmap for the continuum of career development outcomes associated with experiential learning. I think it's important to also note, and especially from some of the sessions that we've been hearing from, that we can't ignore where we are today and the post-pandemic road we're on. Many youth are anxious about the future and are still struggling to be hopeful, considering disrupted learning, economic turmoil, transformed workplaces, and just the difficulty of navigating a world that truly has been changed. So we felt now was the time for a career education framework that can guide career provision across the whole of the curriculum and early learning in school life. Our framework is a working document and will attempt to keep pace with the rapidly changing world we live in. But most importantly, it does acknowledge and address the known barriers to effective transitions through the lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it's important to note that the development of our career education framework in New Brunswick is a result of a collective interest and an investment of many. There was various departments within the government of New Brunswick that contributed to the development of the framework. And this really speaks to the desire of many to be more intentional and to ensure that all our learners are accessing what we know is essential learning. We have also been very fortunate to have had a collaborative relationship with the OECD, and Anthony has been able to provide the research on career readiness and truly has been a valuable asset in providing international perspective and research so that our New Brunswick framework is innovative and forward-thinking. And you're obviously going to hear from him very soon around that. Most importantly, we have been reaching out to stakeholders and rights holders in New Brunswick and different groups and organizations to make sure that their voices are part of the framework. So we did lots of consultation with feedback and input. So the framework truly is the work of many, and we are always aiming to be equitable and inclusive. So I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to talk a little bit more about the research.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tricia. And I think you're absolutely right that, for any framework to be effective, it needs buy-in from multiple stakeholders, and they need to be involved in the process from the beginning all the way through. And that is so essential because, we've seen over the years, many countries introduce frameworks. Some are very, very comprehensive, substantial. Sometimes we see documents with maybe 300 or 400 statements, kind of through them. And others are very different. Sometimes they only have 9 or 10 statements, but within them, we find that you need to work with the community and make a resource which is easy for the community to understand and to use, but at the same time, make sure that it is as effective as possible in terms of what we know about what works in terms of guidance. And so, there's a simple argument for kind of like a framework about why now, why are countries again returning to the idea of frameworks? Because it was about 25 years ago, there was a big push on frameworks. We saw quite a number of countries, but we're kind of finding that there's quite a simple argument really, that in pretty much every country in the world, young people are staying in education longer than ever before. So they need to make more decisions. And, we have, probably the highest qualified, group of young people in the entire history of the human race. And they're going into the workplaces with ostensibly more human capital in their qualifications, as codified them, than ever before in history. But yet we're finding continually that higher qualifications are not always leading to better jobs for young people. And often we find that the ratio of youth to adult employment is high and getting higher for young people. Even though they're getting more qualified, employers are deciding that they'd rather wait for people to have more experience, be older before they hire them. And we could also argue that decision-making is becoming more difficult. We see, not only are people getting more decisions to make, but we see a wider range of options available to young people. Now, they might be in vocational education training or in more general education, but in many systems, we find a proliferation of qualifications being offered, of a growing number of professions which require qualifications to enter them, often at post-secondary level. We also find that we have marketized systems for continuing education, And there, there's an interest on the institution in marketing itself, getting more bums on seats, more people recruitment, whether there's necessarily the economic opportunities there later on or not. And we find as well that societies increasingly recognize that better career guidance is needed for multiple purposes. It's not just about getting a job. It's about the well-being of young people. And it's also about, and this is a theme of this conference, a tool for addressing some of the significant inequalities we see in our societies. And so we have an argument for career guidance because the context is changing, and we expect that to continue to change. And just think about the way AI is probably changing the labour market, but also as well, got substantial new evidence to show that career education really does work, and we kind of know there are core elements of it which should be integrated into any effective system. So if we have a look at the next slide. The framework itself, has three sort of kind of really important areas which it brings in. One is that it focuses on the new evidence, and that's what we're going to talk about on this slide. But also, it covers questions around inequalities and questions around the well-being of students, as well as their career development. But let me just focus on what we know now from our work in 2021. And as Tricia says here in this slide, these are kind of the big ideas around how we structure guidance. Because what we did is we looked at the best available evidence that you could find anywhere in the world to show whether career guidance is actually working or not. And so we looked at longitudinal data sets. So these are ones which follow young people, kind of from childhood, their early childhood, all the way through to adulthood, typically between ages of 15 and 25. And these are surveys which follow the same people. We ask them at 15 what their experience, or we don't ask them, they are asked what their experiences are of career development inside school, outside of school. And we see what can we relate to better outcomes later on. And in this, we control for the things which typically determine how well people do and in work. So gender is important, your social background is important, your academic qualifications are important, the geography of where you live are important. And statistically, you can take account of these things in order to be able to show ultimately, whether we have a significant relationship. So it's 90, 95, 99% chance that there's not coincidence that we see higher wages, lower unemployment rates, better job satisfaction later on, linked to what young people did at school. And when we look at these particular aspects of career development, they group into three areas. Firstly, it's around exploring their potential career pathway. And we'll see that there's a number of aspects of career development which we can positively relate to better outcomes. And we see this we don't see it always, but we see a really strong pattern across sort of multiple countries, including Canada. So firstly, it's how they explore it, and that's typically within school. What they do to critically investigate in the labour market and possible careers which may be of interest to them. And I'll give you some specific examples of that in a moment. But secondly, first-hand experiences. And some of you may have been in the session on work experience placements or part-time working or volunteering. These are first-hand experiences of being in work. And something special happens to young people when they do that as teenagers, while they're still in full-time education, because we see them getting better outcomes later on. And then finally, and this is particularly important, it's about how they think about their potential futures in work. And what we see is, there are a series of questions in longitudinal data sets which allow us to have an understanding of young people actively engaging in thinking about who they might become, what they might do, how they might get there, which are all related to better outcomes. And when we use our PISA data set, so this is the Program for International Student Assessment. Every 3 years, we ask the students about their reading, their maths, their science, and we have these league tables which appear everywhere. But within that, we ask a lot of questions about participation in career development activities and in their career thinking. And we find that the more they explore, the more they're experiencing, the more mature their career thinking is, the more engaged they are in their potential futures and how they might get there. And so if we move to the next slide, and look at the situation in Canada. Now, I'm afraid that the writing's a little bit small here, but what we found when we looked at data from 10 countries, including Canada, was that we found really sort of strong relationships between a range of different activities linked to exploration, experiences, and thinking, and better outcomes. We found a few partial ones as well, but here are the 11 ones which we're absolutely confirmed. And we see the way that, and this table you've got in front of us, this is the data from a Canadian longitudinal study, which questioned young people when they're 15 in the year 2000, and then collected data again in 2010 and 2015, so when they're 25 and 30. And we saw, whether we use the acronym NEAT, means not in education, employment, or training. You might know that as being unemployed. But we also looked at their earnings and whether they had higher earnings than we would expect, so that given, their qualifications, their social background, their gender, and so on. And what we found really was that, there was kind of like a range of exploration activities, including things as simple as a career conversation with the teacher, including things like career talks and job fairs, workplace visits, job shadowing, things which take people out of the classroom into first-hand encounters with people in work. We find strong connections here with better outcomes. And as well with part-time working and volunteering, better outcomes there. And you can see these are the results for Canada, which are very strong. And then finally, in terms of thinking, the more certain young people are. And typically they're asked a question, which is, thinking about age 30, what type of job do you think you'll be doing? And if students can't write in an answer, we classify them as being uncertain. They may change their mind later if they do write one in, or they might become more certain later on. But for us, what it tells us is that it's an indication they're actively thinking about their future while they're still in education, and they can still make decisions at age 15, 16, which are going to influence their progression through education towards the labour market. Career alignment is whether the qualifications they plan to get can be related reasonably to their occupational ambition. So do they, say they want to be a lawyer and expect to do possibly postgraduate levels of education? If they underestimate the education which they need to do, we find very often that they do worse than you would expect. And we find as well what we call instrumental motivation towards school, which is that they can see the value of their education as being beneficial to a future in work. So statements like, working hard at school will help me get a good job. Do you agree or disagree? And so we can find that young people, when they start thinking about their future, that they do end up doing better, and the thinking part relates to the exploration and the experiencing. So let's move on to our next slide. And I won't spend a lot of time on this. You can read about, we call them career readiness indicators. And in the chat, my colleague Alison's put up a link for you. But we just see what this means in practice and the strength of the evidence here. And so we've got a list of the different possible indicators here. And these are kind of statements which can relate to better outcomes and what it means in practice, that they're less likely to be neat, that they're earning more later on. And we find that, this data tends to be concentrated in Australia, Canada, the UK, the US, but that's where the studies are. Many countries don't have these studies, or if they do, they don't ask the right questions. So this gives you a sense of the level of the evidence. And in this area, before we did this work, there was very little to show, then really hard evidence that some of the classic career development activities really do make a difference for young people. And there may be other things which do, which we just don't have data for, but this gives us a really important kind of baseline, a core area of activities which we think should be integrated into any career guided system. And so if you move from exploring to the next slide, which is about experiencing, again, we can see part-time working, hugely valuable for young people. And again, when we see these figures at Canadian teenagers who work part-time at 15, earn 5% more in annual earnings at age 30 than those who didn't, it's controlling for a lot of other factors which might determine about how well they do. And we can see young people getting a head start, and that head start becoming, sustained over time, that they're better placed to be able to move into the labour market, for multiple reasons. So let's move on. How we make sense of this? Well, we kind of make sense of this, particularly at the OECD, by using capitals theory. We kind of see the way that young people, while they're in education, have the opportunity to develop, firstly, relevant human capital. Now, human capital is typically seen as the kind of the qualifications and experience that a young person has. Now, if they're working part-time or they're doing a placement, they gain experience. They might be able to have a recommendation, maybe learn a new skill, but also it helps make better decisions about how they're going to invest their time in education. Are they going to follow a vocational route? And if so, which one? If they're going to stay in education, do they see that in general education? Do they see that as a pathway towards an imagined future? They can be more coherent and more focused and show greater agency in their decisions. Also, we see a really powerful function of social capital. And social capital, in part, is in the relationships that you have in a very substantial way. So if you meet an employer can give you advice, or somebody in work can give you advice about, oh, I wouldn't do that course, or if you're going to want to get into this profession, this is the course to do. But also they can recommend you. They may even offer you a job. We see that happening all the time, particularly after people who do work experience placements in their later teens. But also something really subtle, access to new and trusted information. And we recently published a paper on career talks, which may only be 20, 30 minutes, but because the students engaging with somebody who they feel isn't trying to sell them something, who is providing authentic information, they can believe that, and they do believe that in different ways. And we find that the more exposure that they have, the better they do sort of later on in work. And we had a really interesting paper in this conference from Ingrid Schoon from University College London, which with new data, got very strong evidence now about more is more in terms of these sorts of relationships. And then this aspect of cultural capital, which is around, the ability to demonstrate agency, to visualize and plan a future, but also to, what sociologists talk about, kind of understanding the rules of the game, being a fish in water, developing a vocational identity, so when the transitions happen, you're ready for it and you have a familiarity with it, and it makes it much easier for you to convince an employer that you're a good risk for them. You're going to be, you're somebody they can take a risk on. And so let's move on and show you some of the statements which we developed in thinking about what a successful framework could really look like. And here you see, there's a list of 16 statements which you'll find particularly in the rationale document, which accompanied the new career education framework. And this is based upon kind of the research which we're aware of, some of which we did ourselves, much which was done by other people. And we think about that all students from an early age, from the very first interactions with education, but particularly from primary or elementary school, are helped to start thinking about their potential futures and how they might achieve their ambitions. That the opportunities here, they're prepared to understand them, the opportunities in the labour market, but also its challenges. And this has been a theme. People are talking about critical consciousness a lot. It's important to understand that, there are pitfalls, there are risks in all of this, but also that they understand the role that qualifications and experiences can play and help to mitigate the risks for them. It's important that we're aware of the stress and anxiety which is involved within transitions, and it can be more difficult for students with underlying mental health problems. It's important that all students receive a solid foundation of career preparation, but also, there are systems, and this is something that's really important, which Tricia is going to talk about in a moment, systems in place to identify and support students who require additional, more personalized support. One of the themes of the conference is that one size doesn't fit all. Now, within this, we also want students to understand the changing character of demand for skills, the changing character of demand for employment. Here, we're thinking particularly about the gig economy, which is very attractive to many students, but has drawbacks as well as benefits. And think about the risks there for themselves. So they're going into the labour market with more open eyes. As Tricia says, it's a living document, and it's drawing upon existing practice and framework design. And there is a long history of framework design, and we understand that often where there perhaps are really comprehensive systems which maybe cover every possible aspect of career development, that these become systems which become difficult to use in practice. And you talk to practitioners about them and say, I remember that, let me find it in my cupboard, because it's just too much in terms of the real working world which they're interacting in. And so if we carry on, I'll just finish these off. The best available longitudinal evidence. because, it's not ideal, it's not perfect, but it's the best we have. And, we owe it to our young people to draw upon the best evidence in order to be able to design things which are going to work for them. And to make sure that evidence says that employer engagement is a really key part of this. And we saw that if you think about those exploring and experiencing aspects of career development, that there should be multiple opportunities and diverse opportunities for them to engage with employers and people in work. That seems to be at the heart of a lot of the indicators which you've identified. Now, digital is really important, particularly somewhere like New Brunswick, which is a lot of rural population. But people will be aware of the New Observatory. Digital is really important, and it's not just the resources which are available in digital; it's the capacity of young people to use them. And so, if we go back to kind of elementary, we see this connection between understanding the relationship between education and employment, including challenging forms of stereotypical thinking. And we had some really good papers in the conference on that. And it may well be that some workplaces really are hostile, but young people we need to equip with a critical engagement to make sure they make a right decision for them, and not just based upon their own assumption or somebody else's assumption about what's right and possible. And that links very strongly to the need to understand that young people need better understanding of all post-secondary pathways. We see in the PISA data continually, young people say overwhelmingly, I'm going to go to university. In some countries, 80 or 90% of people say, I'm going to go to university. We have, very low achievers on the PISA tests saying they're definitely going to go to university, where we know that, their levels of literacy are going to make it really struggle for them. But there are also sort of alternatives. There are different stepping stones, but also vocational education, the skilled trades, kind of hot. And many countries, we see a real reputational issue for young people about accessing the skilled trades. And so finally, just to finish, first-hand experiences of work as we store in the data, and that all young people help to actively manage their transitions out of secondary education. And one of my best takeaways from this conference is practice in Armenia, where students spend a day they spend 15 hours creating their own career transition plan. And they need to present that to their teachers, research it, work out exactly what they're going to do afterwards. And there, in many different countries, they've got some great examples of schools and systems actively helping students out of secondary education, and particularly into work, because many schools are very good at it, helping young people into university, but we don't always see it into work as well. And so if we move on to the next slide, which I think is going to be my final slide, we just see here how some of those statements and some of that research fits into these aspects of the career education framework. And this is your first chance to see what it looks like. It's a series of statements, and it's a statements which reflects an expectation that by the different stages of education, young people will have had opportunity to do some very substantial things. As you see there at middle block, at grades 6 to 8, I visited several locations out of my school to discuss the different activities people do there. So there's something which is, we'll put the substantial things there, but also, some of it is attitudinal. I've considered if any of the activities people do there are of interest to me. So we've got a mixture of things which we know relate, which are activity-based, but also drawing on the wider literature around career development of the developmental functions of young people as they go through, their education. And we would worry, as teenagers, if they don't talk regularly to family, friends, mentors, school staff about career pathway plans, about jobs which they're interested, about how they're planning to do it. It's a flag for us. And so here we see in New Brunswick, integrating these insights into the way that our expectations are put in place for what we'd expect at different stages of this developmental process for young people. And that's where I'm going to pause and hand back over to Tricia.
Thank you, Anthony. That was great. And I even had to write something down while you were talking because it piqued my curiosity. But that was a page that you just saw from our framework for exploring. This page that you're looking at right now is from the Thinking Big Idea. And as Anthony says, it really outlines these outcomes on the left-hand side, and then those activities or process that happens in each of those developmental stages. So we've been really intentional, and I chose this page to share with you because it really ties back to a lot of the discussions throughout this conference. We've been very intentional in incorporating the connections between mental health and career development. And I'm very happy that I was able to attend Deidre's session in the last breakout because I really appreciated the connections with Reddekopp and Houston's work on mental health and career development. And so we have been very fortunate here in New Brunswick to work with them with their research, and really wanted to incorporate those connections for young people so they can not only learn how to consider and care for their mental health in life learning and work, but also to understand the connection and relationship with career development being a positive mental health outcome, and that planning and preparing and being hopeful for the future can have positive mental health outcomes. As well, as you can see, there's another outcome here where we connect career development and social justice. And being that I work within education support services, and my focus is how do we ensure that each learner gets to access career education, but also how do we consider ensuring that that we are thinking about and critically examining how to make workplaces fair. We wanted to make that part of our framework and engage young people in those conversations and that thinking. So our framework is intended to be embedded in all subject areas and program blocks, as you just saw on those documents, by curriculum and resource developers, as well as educators and school communities. Further, we have what is called a hopeful transitions model and tool, which I'll talk a little bit more to in a bit. And what that is it's a career pathway transition planning model and tool that uses what you see on the screen, a multi-tiered system of support, the response to intervention or RTI model. And it has our framework, our career education framework, providing direction for that tier 1 foundational and universal career connected learning. And this is the responsibility, tier 1, of all educators. So it's designed to ensure that New Brunswick's provincial curriculum provides each learner with equitable and inclusive career education and pathway planning. So we also use the principles of universal design for learning, or UDL, and the framework addresses barriers to quality career education, participation processes and outcomes, ensuring that each learner is valued and engaged. So within this overarching strategy to enhance educational provision, the framework articulates the activities and experiences, as you saw in the previous 2 slides, that are expected of early childhood all the way to grade 12 students. The framework outlines the career development competencies and attitudes associated with, oh, sorry, the slide changed, with better transition and positive mental health. So, when we're talking about implementation, and so this is what Anthony spoke to at the start of our presentation, that we really wanted to highlight today how we have gone from research to the practical, to how it has actually been used in schools. So I'm going to share with you some of those. It is, the process of implementing and working on the implementation of career education across the curriculum is not always the easiest to reinforce and support, but having a framework has created a common reference point to direction and clarity on how we can all work towards preparing young people for the future. So it's really acting as our roadmap, and is also a way to assist in avoiding duplication and to unite the work of many in education and beyond. So as we continue to work towards stable and student-centered career-connected learning for each learner, it is our goal to have the framework understood, supported, and actively used to guide decision-making and to guide the actions of schools and educators. So I'll share with you a few of the ways that the framework is currently in use. So in elementary schools, educators have been given the opportunity to select from a list of curated free classroom books for facilitating children's exploration of occupational pathways while also considering the social emotional competencies needed to prepare for the future. When educators have selected from the curated books, they are also identifying which of the big ideas and outcomes from the career education framework that they will be using to, they will be achieving through the use of the books. So this group of educators becomes a community of practice where they will be sharing lesson plans and associated activities to achieve their curricular outcomes, but also the outcomes within the career education framework. The portrait of a learner that I spoke of earlier is a document in New Brunswick that identifies the competencies and attitudes learners need to develop through educational and life experiences from their first contact with public school through to their high school graduation. The document outlines the vision and purpose of education to develop learner agency so that all learners have the belief and capacity to take action to make life better for themselves and others now and for future generations. This portrait has been our guiding vision in New Brunswick for modernizing our curriculum, resulting in an inclusion of a larger scope than the traditional subject area outcomes. The career education K-12 framework is now contributing to the modernization of New Brunswick curriculum. It is part of what we call a curriculum writing toolkit that informs the writing and updating of any curriculum and resources that are being developed. It is being used alongside other important frameworks in that toolkit, such as a Wabanaki framework, Black Histories framework, and climate education framework. This ensures the consistent and informed incorporation of career education outcomes across all curriculum areas. Also, most recently, the framework has been used to write an entirely new grade 10 career pathway design course and to update our personal wellness continuum of grades 3 to 9, where we have used it to inform the career connected learning outcomes. This brings us to our hopeful transitions guide and tool that I mentioned earlier. I think this is a nice connection to the opening comments on Wednesday around social justice and the question that was asked about how do we effectively provide career education to those that need it most. And this guide and tool that we are working on in New Brunswick identifies those that need that additional scaffolding and support in the area of career guidance and works to ensure that each learner is successfully planning and preparing for the future. So in recognizing that transition planning and career decision-making is not always equitable in its access or delivery, Hopeful Transitions will utilize the response to intervention model shown on the left-hand side of the screen. And the intent of the model is to scaffold learning so that all learners are able to access career education. So tier 1 is that core classroom instruction that all learners receive. For career connected learning, this is depicted and outlined as our career education framework K-12. It is very clear as to what our educators and learners are aiming to achieve based on what is within the framework document and continuum based on each of those developmental stages. Within tier 1, it will be determined when and if a learner requires additional scaffolding in or interventions to assist in accessing career learning. Tier 2 is that more targeted small group instruction, and tier 3 would be more intensive individual interventions. The intent is that all learners receive tier 1 career education, and tier 2 and 3 do not replace this. They are the supports required to make sure that career education and transition planning happens for each learner. The development of the guide and associated digital tool is underway, and we hope to be using it in our high schools next academic year. This shows the filter mechanism as part of the Hopeful Transitions tool. This is what will allow our educators to identify what they're looking for in supporting the implementation of the career education framework across the curriculum. Educators are often asking how, and that's what this filter can provide. So they can easily find lesson plans, activities, experiential learning opportunities, labor market information, and connections to the community. Lastly, one other example is our most recent example. So the Career Life Plan is a new addition to our graduation requirements in New Brunswick. We are going to be requiring a documented career life plan, which is a comprehensive education, career, and life plan that documents the learning needs, interests, and aspirations of all students. It will be something that the student creates. Hence why I was making some notes when Anthony mentioned that example earlier. So there may be some best practice out there because we are just in the process of developing how this will be supported. What the career life plan will do, it will increase the intentionality of career connected learning along the learning continuum, where learners will be supported in documenting their plan in a digital portfolio year over year until graduation. So as I said, we're underway in determining the best way to support this new graduation requirement, but most certainly our career education framework is providing the context and how we can best support young people in actively planning for their post-secondary lives. So that is the end of my examples, and this is just a link to our site that contains all of the things that I have mentioned today and my contact information.